We're on the top of Daf Ayin Tes Amud Aleph, and we're up to Boyer of Ashi. This is a continuation of the suffix of Rav Papa. It actually parallels the suffix of Rav Papa with regard to Koseves, where the shir of Koseves, which Yechayev Koris on Achilas Yoma Kippurim, includes the Garin or not. Is it the volume of the Koseves without the garin, without the pit, or with the pit? Boy Rav Ashi. And now we're going to learn a Mishnah in Olos. And that's in the second parak of Olos, with regard to what's called Tumas Mes, in which a person walks into an Oel, and inside that Oel, there is a part of a corpse, of a dead body. And in this case, a bone of a dead body. And the halacha is that the tumah of a dead body, in the case of a bone, only applies if the bone has the minimum volume of what's called kisiora. Etzem kisiora. Siora is a kernel of barley. And let's say, for example, a person will touch a bone from a dead body. That's called maga. Or he would carry a bone from a dead body. That's called masa. He is contaminated with tumas mes, which is one of the most severe kinds of tumah. And as a general rule, a mes is metame with a shear of kizayis. But the halacha of etzem is a halacha l'moshe misinai. And that means that we don't need a kizayis, even if it's kishir siora, just the size of a barley kernel, then it's metame. But that's only as far as maga umasa are concerned. As far as tumas oil is concerned, a bone of a dead body is not metame bi oil unless you have the spinal column, all the bones of the spinal column, or at least all the bones of the skull, complete. Another possibility for tumas oil would be if you have most of the limbs of the human being, or if you have so many bones that it could fill the volume of what's called a rova hakav. But what's the suffix now of Rav Papa, of Rav Ashi, excuse me? He says, bikli pasa, o shalo bikli pasa. Are we discussing a kernel with its husk, with its covering, which means we're expanding the volume, or without its volume, without the volume of the klipa, of its covering? And this would mean that we would have to be more machmir if we had an etzem kisiora below klipasa, and that itself would be metame be maga ubemasa. On the other hand, we could be more lenient, and we would say that there's no tumah in the case of an etzem unless it's kisiora bikli pasa, together with its kernel. And that would be more lenient. And we would be more machmir, more strict, if we said it was kisaora below kli pasa. Now Rav Ashi has a different suffix. He vacillates about a saora lacha or o yevesha. When a kernel of barley, or for that matter, any grain, is cut, is harvested, it is now moist. And the moisture sort of blows up the size, the volume of that kernel. But as it gets dry, then it becomes smaller and it shrinks with the dryness. And once again, Rav Ashi vacillates. How do you define the shear of etzem kisaora? Is it the volume of a moist and recently cut kernel, and then we have a kula in that it has to be a larger volume, or is it even a Yevesha, which has a much smaller volume because the Sa'ora has already shrunk, and that itself is enough to create Tumah in the case of an Etzah. Now the Gemara explains and expands that Rav Papa and Rav Ashi did not have a suffix reciprocally, meaning Rav Ashi lo miboy le'lahad Rav Papa. Rav Ashi had no doubt about the question that was raised by Rav Papa, and the answer to that is Gasa Itmar, Kol Kama de Gasa. It was therefore absolutely simple and understood in the mind of Rav Ashi that when the Mishnah speaks about Koseves, a date, it means with its pit, because it says Koseves Hagasa. Gasa means that it's a larger date. What makes it larger? What expands its volume? It's because it has the pit inside. Rav Papa, on the other hand, who had a suffix about the shir of Koseves, lo mi boy lahad Rav Ashi, he had no doubt with regard to the suffix of Rav Ashi in terms of the shir of etzem kisaora for magu masa of a mess. It was absolutely certain to him that we will measure the volume of a sa'ori vesha, which, as we said before, is a chumrah because it's much smaller, but it's got to be bikli pasa together with its chaff. And the reason why Rav Ashi found this absolutely simple and straightforward is because lacha is not called siora. It has a different name to it. You wouldn't call it a siora, but rather shiboles mikri. The word in Lashon Kodesh, in the Hebrew tongue, for a freshly cut and moist kernel of barley is shiboles. And the word shiboles indicates that it hasn't yet completely developed. It's not a full-fledged siora. And why is it that Rav Ashi was absolutely convinced that we're talking shelo b'kli pasa? And the answer is shelo b'kli pasa ushla mikri. It's not called a siora if it's been stripped of its covering, of its husk. So therefore, the siora that the Chacham spoke about must be yevesha, it's dry, and it's bikli pasa, it is still surrounded by its husk. Omar Rabba, Omar Rabbi Yehuda, Koseves Hagasa Sha'omru, when the Mishnah says that you're chayav if you eat on Yom Kippur, even a small portion that has the size of a date, Yisera Mikabetza, that shears a little bit more than an egg size. And even though, as far as the general universal rule of prohibited foods and that which you're not allowed to eat in the Torah, shear is kizayis, but achila on Yom Kippurim is different because the Torah never says thou shalt not eat on Yom Kippur. All it says is, in nisem es nafshul seichem, v'kol nefesh asher lo te'una b'yetzem hayom hazeh, the Kimlu Rabbanon, and the Chachamim were experts, and they knew Ibahachi miyasva daite. Once you eat a koseves hagasa, even though in other isurim it depends on a kizayis, but in the question of Yom Kippur, as far as inui is concerned, the opposite of inui, the state of being, is described as Yasva Datayu, which in Hebrew translates as Misyasheves Daito. He no longer feels that intense hunger pain because he has Yishuv Adas, and that will be achieved when he eats a size of a Koseves Hagasa. But Batzir Mihachi, if he eats less than a Koseves Hagasa, Lo Miyasve Daite, he will not feel that he has relieved that pain of hunger. And therefore, at that point, he has not violated the Isur Inui. He still is in a state of Inui because he ate less than a Koseves Hagasa. He's still, as we said before, in the state of Inui. He's what we call in Hebrew Me'una. And if he's Me'una, therefore he doesn't violate the Isur of Yom Kippurim. The Shir of Achila has to be something that is Miyashev Daito Shel Adam. He's no longer Me'una. And the Chacham understood that the Shir, the volume of eating, to take a person out of the state of Me'una is Kikoseves Hagasa. The Gemara now raises an objection from the Mishnah on Rabbi Yehuda, who claimed that Koseves Hagasa for the share of Achil of Yom Kippurim is greater than a kibetza. And the Mishnah says in Masechet Sukkah on Daf Chavav and Beis, Maisa, there was a story on Chag HaSukkos, Ve'eviu l'Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai litom es hatavshil. They gave him to taste a food. They prepared food for him, l'kavod yontif. And when it says litom es hatavshil, it means a small amount of the tavshil. That's called te'ima, and it wasn't a suda. Now, te'ima is otherwise known in Gemara Sukkah as achilas aroi, a kind of temporary kind of achila. And l'Ram Gamliel, they brought shtei kosvos, 2 dates, udli shel mayim, and a pail of water. And in the case of drinking water, even if you drink a very large volume, that's not called keva. No matter how much water you drink, it's called shtias aroi, a temporary kind of shtia. V'amru, they told Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Gamliel, ha'alum lasukkah. I'm sorry, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Gamliel told them ha'alum lasukkah. They didn't want to eat outside the sukkah. V'tani Allah, and the Gemara quotes a brisa to explain the Mishnah, Shelo Amru Kain Mipnei Shalachakach Ela Sheratzu Lahachmir Al Atzma. That this was not a strict requirement of the law, the letter of the law, because you're allowed to eat an achilas haroi, a very temporary kind of snack, or shtiyas haroi, outside the sukkah, but the Chachamim wanted to be macher. They took upon themselves a chumrah, and they didn't want to have anything to eat whatsoever outside the sukkah. The Mishnah now tells us another story. Ukshenasnu lo Rabbi Tzadok ochel pachas mikabetza. When they gave Rabbi Tzadok a food, probably it was made of bread, but it was less than a kibetza. And Rabbi Tzadok was mekil in 3 different ways. Number 1, lo natal yadav. He did not wash his hands. He was of the opinion that pachos mikabeta ain ton tefillah. He doesn't need netilas yadayim. Now, once he forgoes netilas yadayim, netalo b'mapa, he needed to hold on to the pas, this piece of bread, the small piece of bread that was less than a kibeta, in a cloth. He took a cloth, and this has to do with a concept which is a little bit out of our realm for today, that's called aninus hadas, which means that he couldn't tolerate that which was disgusting in his eyes, right? It was called a davar mos. It was repugnant in his eyes to eat by holding on to the bread without washing his hands, Rab Tzadok felt he couldn't tolerate this. That's the sheet of Rashi. Here Tosa has a different shita that Rabbi Tzadok fit into a profile of called a Kohen, Sha'achal Chulin B'Tara, and so forth. Number 3, Achalo Chutz L'Sukkah. He was willing to eat a piece of bread that was less than a kibetza outside the sukkah, and he was of the opinion that that is an achilas haroy. It's a temporary kind of snack, and it's potum min sukkah. This reminds me that when I was a kid, they used to say, do you have to wash on pizza? So they used to tell us that if you're eating 1 slice of pizza, you don't have to wash. If you're eating 2 slices of pizza, you do have to wash. Very similar to this Gemara about Rabbi Tzadok, that he didn't wash for a piece of bread that was less than a kibetza, and he would eat such a piece of bread outside the sukkah because he held that this is called an achilas haroy. It's a temporary snack and not a real achila kvua set eating, a meal. He did not feel you needed netilas yadayim, and he did not require a sukkah. V'lo berach achra. In other words, the minimum amount of pas, of bread that you have to eat in order to be chayav birkas hamazon is what's called kidei svia. The Torah says that you have to be satiated. V'achalta v'savata berachta. And a person is not satiated unless he eats a kibetza's worth of pas. And here, they brought Rabbi Tzadok a pas that was less than a kibetza, and he did not bench after he ate the pas. And now we turn to Daf Ayin Tes Amid Beis. The Gemara says that we should be very careful about reading this Mishnah, very meticulous. And the Mishnah says that this foodstuff was less than a kibetza. Ha kibetza. The implication of the Mishnah would be that if this pas had the size, the minimum volume of a kibetza, then by sukkah, you would require eating it in the sukkah. The only reason Rabbi Tzadok ate this pas outside the sukkah is because it had less than a shear of kibetza. Had it had a shear of kibetza, then he would have eaten it in the sukkah. Isal kedaita. If you're going to entertain the idea that kosevas agasa sha'amru yisera mikabetza, if you accept Rabbi Yehuda's underlying premise that a kosevas agasa in the mission of Yom Kippurim is greater than a kibetza, then hashta now shtei kosavos, they brought in front of Rabbi Gamliel 2 kosavos below garin, right? Because people don't eat dates that have pits in them. Lo havi kibetza, and the shear is less than a kibetza. In other words, if the shear for a kibetza of a chiv sukkah minadin is the shear of a kibetza, then I don't understand. How is it possible for Rabbi Gamliel, when they fed him shtei kosavos, and he said that Mikra did, you don't have to eat it in the sukkah? Well, shtei kosavos would certainly be the equivalent of a shear of kibetza. So kosevas hagasa v'garineha v'garinasa mihavi. Would it be that it's possible it's yisera mikabetza? Right, the garin is not greater in size than the food that surrounds the garin, the pit, meaning the date itself. And therefore, it should not be greater than 2 kosavos without garin. 1 kosevas hagasa with its pit should not be greater in size and volume than 2 kosavos without its pit. Because again, since the pit is smaller than the size of the date itself, of the koseves, then for sure, you have the equivalent of at least one kibetza, right? Because if you assume the garin, the pit, is less than the size of the ochel itself, meaning the date, then the kosevas hagasa would not be greater than 2 kosamos without a garin. And if that be the case, then the amount and the volume of food that was presented to Rabbi Gamliel was more than a kibetza, and therefore he was required, mikar adin, according to the strict letter of the law, to eat it in the sukkah. And yet, the Gemara says, with regard to Rabbi Gamliel, that lo amru mipnei halacha kach ela sheratza lahachmir al atzmo. Why is it a chumra al atzmo? We see here that a koseves, if it's the size of a kibetza, then certainly you have to eat it in the sukkah. Our answer is Rabbi Yirmiyah in. You're right. Shtei koseves below garinasa lo avi kibetza. If you remove the pits from these 2 dates, you're left with a shear, a volume that is actually less than a kibetza. Whereas koseves hagasa v'garinasa havi yisera mikibetza. If you would have presented Rabbi Gamliel with a koseves hagasa together with its pit, that would be greater than a kibetza, and then certainly Rabbi Gamliel would not eat this outside of the sukkah mikra din. And now the Gemara wants to support Rabbi Yochanan. I'm sorry, Rabbi Yirmiyah. Amar Rav Papa, Hainu diamri inchi. This is what people are used to say. Trei kabi de tamri. A kav is a certain volume, a measurement, in this case, of dates. And shnei kavim of dates with a garinim is yesh chad kabo de kashiyosa v'sariach. There'll be 1 kav of pits, and sariach means an overflow, a surplus. So we see that Rabbi Yirmiyah is right that the garin of the tamar is even greater in its volume than the food that surrounds this pit. Rava Amar, Rava says, no, let's go back to the svara that we had in the Makchan, that a koseves hagasa v'garinosa is certainly more than a kibetza, and 2 kosovos is not less than that shear of 1 koseves hagasa. Hasam, but there in the Mishnah, when it says that Rabbi Gamliel was given shtei kosovos of tamarim, then minadin, the Mishnah says it would have been mutter for him to eat it outside the sukkah, even though it's kibetza. Hainu time mishum da'avile peri uperi lo boy sukkah. A koseves, which is a date, is a fruit, and fruit can be eaten outside the sukkah no matter how much of a volume and how many fruits he eats. And why is this so? So Rashi and the Rosh and others explain because ein derech lekvoa aleim seuda. You don't usually set up a meal on fruits. Again, if you're on an Atkins diet, maybe all you eat for a meal is fruits. But generally speaking, people don't eat a meal of fruits. Even the health freaks don't go that far. Although there is a certain diet I remember from my youth where you eat grapefruits the whole day. Anyway, ein derech lekvoa aleim seuda al kain kvi usam eina chashuva kvius. The fact that he decides he's making a meal out of fruit does not make it objectively into a set meal. Ela kachilas harai, and it has the status of a temporary meal. And therefore, when it comes to fruit, like dates in our case, even if he eats a great volume, he's allowed to eat it outside the sukkah. That is the opinion of Rava. However, some anonymous member of the crew of the Beis Medrash, one of the Amoraim, says that that's against a brisa. Rava is contradicted by a brisa. Which brisa? Omar Rebbe, Shayinu lomdim Torah Eitzel Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, Heviu lefanenu te'enim v'anovim, v'achalnum achilas haroi chutz l'sukkah. Now watch what happens. When Rebbe points out that they ate these fruits, there were figs, there were grapes, and they ate it outside the sukkah. He adds two words. Achilas aroy. The reason why we were allowed to eat this outside the sukkah is not because they were fruits, but rather because we ate it as a snack. We weren't kovea a suda. Achilas aroy in, achilas keva lo. Had they eaten a shear of kibetza, which is called achilas keva, they would not be allowed to eat it outside the sukkah, despite the fact that we're talking about fruit, figs and grapes. So this contradicts Rava, because Rava says you're allowed to eat as many peros, no matter what volume of fruits that you want to eat. It's always, by definition, considered achilas aroy, and it's allowed to be eaten outside the sukkah. Here we see that the only reason Rebbe allowed it is because it was an achilas aroy. Had it been an achilas keva, it was more than a kibetza, then that makes it into achilas keva, even though it's a fruit, even though we're dealing with figs and grapes, and you'd be allowed to eat it outside the sukkah. So holds Rebbe, but that's against Rabbi Yehuda. Amos, says the Gemara, you know what? Let's change one point here in our understanding of this brisa. As far as Rebbe's intention is, achalnum, we would have eaten these figs and these dates, even in great volume. Ke'achilas aroy chutz l'sukkah. Add the chaf hadimyon here. It's not that we ate it achilas aroy, but no matter how much we would have eaten of these figs and grapes, we would have been considered ke'achilas aroy. Which means we have the din of achilas aroy. It's like, eating a small snack on the run, and you're allowed to eat that chutz l'sukkah. So Rebbe is testifying to the fact that we ate peros, and we were not chayiv in sukkah, even if we were to eat a large volume of figs and grapes. It is always, by definition, achilas aroy, and it's mutter outside the sukkah. Now the Gemara wants to defend Rava with a different answer, an alternative answer. And maybe Rebbe is talking about achilas pas, not just about fruits. Achalnum, we ate these fruits, achilas keva. Ve'achalnu pas, achilas aroy ba'adayu. And therefore, chutz l'sukkah, it had the status of achilas aroy, and it was mutter outside of the sukkah. So now the Gemara is offering another possible answer and trying to interpret Rebbe as referring to achilas pas as well. And when Rebbe says we would eat these fruits, he means achilas keva, no matter how much of a volume of fruits we ate, and it's not chayiv in sukkah. And then, in addition, achalnu pas achilas haroy. So the achilas haroy is an adjective describing pas, not peros. As far as peros is concerned, we don't need to add that description of achilas haroy, because by definition, no matter how much of a volume of peros you eat, it's always called achilas haroy. The words achilas haroy in this brisa are a reference to achalnu pas. Again, does it say in the brisa achalnu pas? It does not. But the Gemara is adding that to the brisa. Lema Messiah le. Let's quote a brisa that would support Rava's assumption that achilas peros are not chayav in sukkah, no matter how many peros you eat. And now we're going to learn another Mishnah in sukkah, that according to Rabbi Eliezer, you're obligated during the course of sukkahs to eat no less than 14 meals in the sukkah. How does he get to number 14? In those days, they ate breakfast and supper. They didn't have lunch. meals, like if you go to a hotel, half board, right? So you don't eat lunch. So they had 2 meals a day, one during the day and one at night. And this went on day after day for 7 days during Sukkot. So they needed 14 meals to be eaten in the Sukkot. Chachamim say no. There's only a Chiv Sud on one night out of the entire Sukkot, and that's on the first night of Yontif. Now, the Brisa is going to focus our attention on the 14 meals that we're obligated to eat in Sukkah during the course of the holiday, according to Rabbi Eliezer. Lefichach, im hishlim b'minei targima, yotza. Now, what does the word lefichach mean in this context? Therefore, it means very strange. It's almost as if he started a sentence with therefore, a paragraph with therefore. So the Gemara in Sukkah doesn't have the word lefichach in its text. And we might be tempted to follow suit here and take out the word lefichach. Let's read it like this. Im hishlim b'minei targima. If he completed his Suda with dessert, let's call it minei targima as a dessert, and this is what's called dvarim hamalaftim bahem es hapas. For example, fish, meat, other things that are eaten together with a pas in a meal, with a loaf of bread or a slice of bread. Yatsa. He has fulfilled his mitzvah of Su'uda. One of the 14 Su'udos that Rabbi Eliezer holds that you're chayiv to eat can be made of a hashlama b'minei targima, some sort of a food stuff that would normally accompany bread. What does this have to do with the principle of Rava? Isal kedaitach the peri boy sukkah, if you're going to assume against Rava, that in the case of peros, if you eat a certain volume, a large volume of peros, then you're chayiv in sukkah. Is listening, the Tana of this brisa should have said, Hishlim beperos yotza, that he finishes his meal by eating fruits. And it would seem from this brisa that peros don't have a chiyuv sukkah at all. And therefore the concept of lahashlim, to complete his suda, would not be applicable if you're dealing with fruits. Dealing with something like fish or meat, that you could call minei targima shemalaftin bahem es hapas. But if you're eating fruit, that's called isal kedai the peribo. And now assuming that if you eat a large volume, against Rava for a moment, just to argue, that if you eat a large volume of fruit, then you're chayav in sukkah, then lisnei peros. The Mishnah, the Brisa could have said hishlim be peros yotza. It would seem, therefore, that we have to assume that peros, no matter how many fruits you eat, are not in a category that would generate a chiyuv sukkah at all, and therefore he couldn't be mashlim his suda with fruits. That would support Rav. The Gemara now rejects this proof. My mini targima. What does the Brisa mean by mini targima? It means peros. And on the contrary, the Brisa is saying that he can complete his Suda by eating peros, and he's chayav in Sukkah. So we see clearly that on the contrary, peros would be chayav in Sukkah. Otherwise, it couldn't be mashlim the Suda. Ibais Ema, the Gemara now wants to offer another alternative explanation of the Brisa and say that mini targima, it means dvarim hamalaftin bahem es hapas, like we said before, basar vidogin. And the Brisa mentions mine targima and not peros. Why is that? And the answer is bi'asher lo shchichei peri. It was in an area, a location where they didn't have peros. We take it for granted that there are fruits that you can import all over the world. But in those days, they didn't have such sophisticated import and export industry. And therefore, they could not import peros in that area. They didn't have peros. And it seems from the Gemara in its techia, it deflects this, that peros are actually chayiv in sukkah. But again, the Mefarshim explained that that's only peros mishivas haminim, like we spoke about the Einim, we spoke about Anovim, we spoke about Kikoseves, and that's what we have. Now, at this point, the Gemara takes a little bit of a break from the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Again, Rabbi Yehuda holds that a Koseves Agasa is larger than a Kibetza. And now the Gemara quotes a dissenting view, and that's Rav Zvid, who is going to maintain that a Koseves Agasa is less than a Kibetza. Rav Zvid Omar, Koseves Agasa Sha'omru, which we said was the shear of Achila and Yom HaKippurim to be Chayiv Kares, Chasera mi Kibetza, it's actually less than a Kibetza. And Rabbi Yehuda, if you recall, was of the opinion that Koseves Agasa is more than a Kibetza. Rav Zvid holds Koseves Agasa Chasera mi Kibetza, it's less than a Kibetza. Now, until this point, until this quote from Rav Zvid, we did not have on the table any opinion that Koseves Agasa is less than a Kibetza. We only had the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that a Koseves Agasa. I may have said that wrong. What I meant to say is that up until Rav Zvid, we never had an opinion that Koseves Agasa is larger than a Kibetza. Right? In other words, Rabbi Yehuda was the one who said that Koseves Agasa is larger than a Kibetza. And until Rav Zvid came along, we never encountered a Shita that maintained that Koseves Agasa is less than a Kibetza. And that's exactly what Rav Zvid is arguing, that Koseves Agasa, for the shear of Yom HaKippurim B'Achila, is chayav. It's chesera. It's a little bit less than a Kibetza. And that's the opposite of Rabbi Yehuda, who insisted that Koseves Agasa is larger than a Kibetza. Just 1 second, sorry. And this machlokes, where the Koseves Agasa is more than a Kibetza, or less than a very odd machlokes. It's a question of reality. I mean, why don't you just check out and see what's the size of a kibetza. What's the size of a kotzeves hagasa? It's not the same as the suffix of a papa with regard to kotzeves im garinoso, without garinoso, the suffix of Ashi, in the case of a kisaora minames. Very strange. Disnan, now the Gemara wants to prove the Shita of Rav Zvid, that Kosevas Hagasa is less than a Kibetza. And now we're going to quote the Mishnah at the beginning of Masechet Beitza with regard to the Isur Bal Yirah B'Yimotze on Chometz B'Pesach. Beit Shammai Omrim, CR. There's something called CR, which is a leavening agent. It means it's Machme Mechametz Es HaIsa. If I'm not mistaken, in our language, that's called yeast. Let me just double check that for a second. Yes, I think I was right. CR is a leavening agent like yeast. There may be other leavening agents, but yeast is your classic. And Beit Shammai Omrim CR the kizayis. You're not allowed to eat a kizayis of CR. Avol chametz, which is not as leavened, the hard leavening like yeast, is kikoseves. That the shear of the Isur chametz, according to Beit Shammai, in the case of regular chametz, not CR, is a kizayis. Is a koseves. Now, the shear of koseves is larger than a kizayis, as we mentioned earlier when we spoke about Yom Kippur. Beis Hillel are of the opinion that zev shiuro b'kizayis, that even regular classic chametz, without any yeast, its shear is a kizayis. And we don't have to wait till you have chametz of a koseves, which is greater than a kizayis. Vavinin ba. And when we were dealing with Beit Shammai, asking questions back and forth to investigate a shita, we asked my time in the Beit Shammai, why don't they equate the shear of chametz with the shear of CR, which is exactly what Beis Hillel had done, and they're both a kizayis. And the answer that we gave was, Nichtov Rachmana, the Torah could have said, Lo yirah lecha chametz, and it didn't have to say Lo yirah lecha siyar. V'am ana mina, we could have said our own. Me chametz she'en chimutzo kosher osur b'kizayis, siyar she'chimutzo kosher lo kolshkein, that it's osur b'kizayis. So why did the Torah have to mention siyar? You've already mentioned chametz, and I can derive siyar from chametz with a kal v'chomer. Chametz is chimutzei kosher, whereas CR, chametz is ein chimutzo kosher, and yet, despite that, you're chayav with a kizayis, is CR, goes without saying, which is chimutzo kosher, certainly would be also a kizayis. Lo kolshke. So Mina Palgina and Rachmana, why did the Torah differentiate between chametz and sior? As Beit Shammai, lim b'chalacha, in order to teach us that shiur shel zeh lo kishiur shel zeh. They are two separate categories of an Isur chametz, and the nafkamina is going to be the shear. What is the shear? So that's where Beit Shammai has the shita sior, which is chimutza kosher b'kezayis, and chametz you won't be chayav until you eat a kikoseves, which is larger than a kezayis. And now we understand why the Torah felt compelled to write both chametz and sior, because had the Torah only mentioned chametz, and we would derive sior from a kavachomer from chametz, then we would have said dayalavam and adin lios kenadun, and sior would have a shear of koseves. Therefore, the Torah had to mention sar explicitly to teach us the shear of a kezayis. Now the Gemara says, the isal kedaita, if you're going to tell me that koseves agasa sha'omer, with regard to Yom Kippur, is yisera mika beitza, that was Rabbi Yehuda Shita, that koseves is larger than a beitza, is michti. Now I have a problem, because Beit Shammai, as far as the iser of chametz, ashiura de nafesh mikazayis kamahadre, they were looking at a shear that was greater than a kezayis in order to separate between sior, which is a shear kezayis, and chametz. Lachein amru b'koseves. Now it makes sense that it says koseves and hayimotziim shear shukata b'koseves v'gadol mikazayis on mitzayim bo. Umeyata now imka koseves yisera mikabeitza. Is lisnei kibetza. The Tana should have mentioned the shear of kibetza, which is more than a kezayis, less than a koseves. And ve'inami ki hadodiv minu, and even if the koseves was not larger, it didn't exceed beyond that of a kibetza, it's exactly equal to a kibetza, we still would ask the question, nisnei kabetza. The Mishnah should have formulated its halacha in terms of a kibetza. Why? Because that's the shear that everybody is familiar with, not the shear of a koseves. Elav shma mina. From here, we're going to prove that koseves pchusa mi kibetza. That's a support for Rav Tzvid against Rav Pop, against Rav Yudis.